Have we misunderstood the biblical definition of marriage? This isn't a question we ask ourselves often, but perhaps we should. Could our traditional understanding of biblical marriage be lacking? Maybe the biblical depiction of marriage isn't just about one man, one woman. Indeed, the Bible presents a myriad of marital arrangements, each unique in its own way. So, how about we shake up things a bit? Let's venture into the biblical text and see what it really says about marriage. Consider the patriarchs of the Old Testament and their marital arrangements. A fascinating journey through the annals of biblical history reveals a pattern of polygamy and concubines. Let's delve into this further. Abraham, the great patriarch, father of many nations, is our first stop. The book of Genesis, chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, records an intriguing tale. Sarah, Abraham's wife, unable to bear children, gives her servant Hagar to Abraham as a secondary wife. Hagar becomes the mother of Abraham's first son, Ishmael. This was an accepted form of marriage in that time, a custom to ensure the continuation of a family line. Next, we turn to Jacob, another significant figure. Genesis chapters 29 and 30 narrates a complex marital arrangement involving two sisters, Leah and Rachel, and their servants, Bilhah and Zilpah. Jacob initially intended to marry Rachel but was tricked into marrying Leah. Eventually he married Rachel as well, and both Leah and Rachel gave their servant girls to Jacob as secondary wives. From these relationships, the 12 tribes of Israel were born. Our journey through the Old Testament brings us to King Solomon, a man renowned for his wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 3 tells us of Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines. This, though hard to fathom in today's context, was a common practice among kings of that era, often to solidify political alliances. These examples depict a form of marriage that involved one man with multiple wives, often supplemented with concubines or servant girls. It's important to note that these practices were deeply ingrained in the culture and societal norms of the time. The Bible does not explicitly endorse these practices, but neither does it condemn them. Instead, it presents them as they were, reflecting the reality of the historical context. Clearly, the Bible presents more than one model of marriage, and as we continue to explore biblical marriage, we'll see that it's a complex, multifaceted subject, far removed from our modern preconceptions. Let's take a look at another form of biblical marriage, the Levirate marriage. This interesting marital arrangement comes from an ancient Hebrew custom, as highlighted in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. Here we find an unusual command. If a man dies without having a son to carry on his name, his brother is required to marry the widow. The first son born of this union would then carry on the deceased brother's lineage. This practice, known as Levirate marriage, was all about preserving a man's name and estate within his family. Now, this might sound strange to our modern ears, but in the context of ancient Israel, it was a serious matter of social security. Women in those days were financially dependent on their husbands, and childless widows were particularly vulnerable. A Levirate marriage protected these women from destitution by ensuring they had a male heir to provide for them. But what if the surviving brother refused to marry his brother's widow? Well, the Bible provides for that too. The widow could perform a somewhat humiliating public ceremony, involving the removal of the brother's sandal and spitting in his face. After this, he would be known in Israel as the unsandaled one. As you can see, the Bible's depiction of marriage is far from monolithic. What about the New Testament? Does it provide a different perspective on marriage? Let's delve into this. One of the most referenced passages when discussing New Testament views on marriage is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 2. Here, the Apostle Paul encourages monogamy, stating, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." This suggests a shift from the Old Testament's allowance of polygamy, advocating instead for a one-on-one marital relationship. Next, we turn our attention to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 19 verses 4 to 6. Here, Jesus himself speaks on marriage, reminding his listeners of the Genesis creation story. He emphasizes the idea of two people, one man and one woman, becoming one flesh in the bond of marriage. This further underscores the New Testament's endorsement of monogamy. However, it's important to note that even in the New Testament, marriage is not presented as the ultimate goal or the highest ideal. In fact, within the same chapter of 1 Corinthians we discussed earlier, Paul suggests in verse 8 that it's better to remain unmarried. He writes, "To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am." So, we see that even in the New Testament, there's a nuanced view of marriage. It's not a one-size-fits-all institution, but rather one that invites thoughtful consideration and personal discernment. So, what have we learned about biblical marriage? Our exploration has led us down intriguing paths, offering fresh perspectives on the diverse marital arrangements found in the Bible. We've seen that biblical marriage is not a one-size-fits-all concept, but a tapestry woven from various threads of societal norms and spiritual directives. We delved into the Old Testament and encountered a world where polygamy and concubines were not just accepted, but often the norm. A stark contrast to today's widespread practice of monogamy, yet this was part of the biblical narrative reflecting cultural norms of the time. Then, we examined the intriguing concept of Levirate marriage, a unique marital arrangement that served as a social safety net, ensuring the continuity of a man's lineage and providing security for widows. This practice, while foreign to many of us today, was another thread in the diverse fabric of biblical marriage. Finally, we ventured into the New Testament, where a shift towards monogamy was evident. Yet, even here we found an acknowledgement that marriage, while honoured, was not the ultimate goal for everyone. The Apostle Paul, for instance, advocated for a life of singleness to better serve God, adding yet another dimension to our understanding of biblical marriage. By revisiting biblical marriage, we've seen that it's a complex and dynamic concept shaped by cultural, historical, and spiritual factors. Perhaps it's time to rethink our understanding of biblical marriage.